Hi there. For this video, we're going to be talking about Virginia and New England, the first two English colonies that were founded in 1607 and 1620, respectively. So, Virginia and New England, in the traditional narrative of American history, and I really mean traditional, I mean this narrative goes back to at least the year 1800 or so, are seen as sort of the two poles of English colonization, North and South. Mammon versus God, money versus piety, aristocratic slavery versus New England's middle-class freedom. And what we're going to see is that historians have been reconsidering those polarities, that divide between Virginia and New England. And yet they still think and recognize that the two colonies present a really interesting contrast with each other. You can certainly see sort of the notion of these opposites in these two images. John Smith, he's this guy right here. John Smith and the settlers at Jamestown 13 years earlier, they are shown as sort of rough and ready. They're already engaging with Indians just as they land, but notice they've got their guns ready. They're certainly just as ready to do battle as they are to make friends. Meanwhile, the Puritans arriving in New England, these are the actual pilgrims arriving at Plymouth Rock, even though this is a fictionalized representation, are depicted as missionaries on a religious quest, with their eyes turned skyward to God, or if not skyward, to their children. If you look at these two images, notice that the John Smith Virginia image down here has absolutely no women among the English settlers, whereas the Puritans have got women galore. So these two stories, that of Virginia and that of New England, are often seen to represent two sides of English colonization. One, Virginia ready to fight and engage and conquer and make money through brute force if need be, and the other, New England, looking for religious freedom. So let's start with Virginia. Certainly it is absolutely true that their goals really were pretty mercenary. John Smith and his colonists were coming to America to make a buck, not to raise families. They wanted to find gold if they could find it, and if they couldn't find gold, they wanted a cash crop, which eventually they found, taking the idea from the Indians to grow tobacco. It's also true that they had very few women traveling with them. In fact, there were no women on the first trip. These were men who intended to come to America to get rich and then go back. Now, for a long time, Jamestown was viewed as an example of how hard-headed Englishmen could withstand any challenge if economic success was before them. They were viewed in sort of a heroic light. But in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, historians started to reevaluate that narrative and sort of reversed course exactly and argued that Jamestown was, in fact, a total fiasco, noting that the English were completely unprepared to grow food or to even last through a single winter alive, and it was only John Smith's dictatorial tyranny over them that managed to save even a few English settlers. And ultimately, the only reason that Jamestown survived was because the Native Americans, who were far more prepared and, at the time, powerful, died of disease, giving the English a huge advantage over them. But in the last 20 years or so, historians have done something which I think is interesting. They've sort of tried to move away from the question of whether or not Jamestown was a success, yay, or a fiasco, boo, and instead are trying to figure out what Jamestown means for the way that English people colonized. And I'll say, here's a place where you can enter in. We don't really have an answer yet. We don't totally know how their relationships with Native Americans went. We have lots of evidence, but we haven't interpreted it finally. We don't totally know how their economic plans were carried out, etc. So there's an opening here. So if we're talking about Virginia, we should talk about Pocahontas. Here is how the story of John Smith and Pocahontas has been told most commonly. Here's John Smith, you can see him lying right here, and you can see Powhatan, the Indian king was his title, of the Powhatan tribe, same name, preparing to kill John Smith with whatever blunt instrument this is. And here, on top of John Smith is Indian maiden Pocahontas acting out of love to save John Smith from Powhatan's cruelties. And I should say again that is the way, contrary to all evidence, which suggests that John Smith and Pocahontas were certainly never in love. Contrary to all evidence, that is the way that story has frequently been told, and until the last 100 years or so, 50 years even, by reputable historians. Now, this image is from the late 19th century. It's making up tons of stuff. But let's look at the next image. Now, this image is actually much closer to the time. It's certainly within 100 years of, I think actually about 30 years of John Smith's rescue. And it's still told from an English perspective. This is more English art. So here is Powhatan, here is John Smith, and here is, again, Pocahontas. Now, I should say, however, that notice some of the differences. Powhatan is in the background. He himself isn't actually going to kill John Smith. Instead, it's another Indian up here who's preparing to do it. And instead, Powhatan is sort of orchestrating what's going on. And notice also how many spectators there are. It's a large crowd gathered around to see this happen. And that fits a little bit in with what historians have found. Excuse my dog. What historians have found actually appears to have happened in this situation. Powhatan didn't want to kill John Smith. That actually would have been a pretty dumb move on his part. It would have made the English enormously mad. It's probably the only thing that would have gotten the English to really take revenge and right out kill the Native Americans right then. It would have been a dumb political move. Instead, what Powhatan was doing was staging an adoption ceremony. And this happened not just in this situation, but in many situations. As a standard ritual, they would have the adopted son, the soon-to-be adopted son, face death. You see, he's facing death in the form of this axe and these other weapons. And then another member of the tribe would save, I'm putting that in air quotes, save the soon-to-be adopted son. So Powhatan here was attempting to bring John Smith into the tribe via a well-established Indian ritual. And the reason he was doing that was not because he felt, ooh, boy, here's this white guy, I'd like to make him my son, but instead because he was attempting to gain control over him. He knew that John Smith was powerful, and he wanted to dominate him. If he is his son, then Powhatan can be in control. Now, all of this makes sense from a Native American perspective. None of it made sense from John Smith's perspective. John Smith completely misunderstood this experience. I believe he really did think that Pocahontas had saved him, that he really was going to die if she hadn't saved him. But it's worth noticing just how much he got wrong. finally, here's a picture of Pocahontas. This is after she moved to England. This is after she married another John Rolfe. But if you take a look at this sort of, I think, might help reevaluate your notion of Pocahontas. She looks regal. She's dressed in the latest fashion. We would mock this, but people in Queen Elizabeth's time certainly didn't. She's dressed in a way that says, I am powerful and important. She is not a humble, lithe, colors of the wind Disney princess. Now, as for New England, New England was for a long time taken to stand for a sort of proto-middle-class ideal, the template for what the urban northern middle class looks like or thinks it looks like right now. Religious, sober, and relatively equal, not with a huge desire for anyone to be enormously rich, and certainly a desire to avoid having enormously poor people around. But historians have recently shown that New England, for one thing, wasn't normal. New England wasn't the pattern on which other colonies based themselves. Instead, New England was an outlier. Almost no one came to America the way that the original Puritans came to America. No one came together in coordinated migration of hundreds and thousands of people. Instead, pretty much everyone came over in more random fashion, either as indentured servants or family by family. Some historians have actually looked even deeper into New England and argued that the Puritans were much more like the people in Jamestown in Virginia than we previously thought. They were more into making a buck. They were more mercenary and violent and perhaps less pious than people have thought. Also, as you'll see or you have seen in the reading, there was a great deal of dissent among even the most pious travelers. You'll find a lot of arguments and anger among these people who supposedly were all in it together. So I would say, if you want to take anything away from this, you might notice that these histories are in flux. New Englanders weren't necessarily all united behind a goal of building a city on a hill. They had a great deal of dissent, and they were more than willing to commit genocide among Native Americans if that would help them succeed economically. Meanwhile, historians have been reevaluating Virginia's status as a colony based on coercion, noting that the colony began truly to succeed, not with John Smith's dictatorship right at the beginning, but instead when indentured servants started to be promised land of their own once they finished their term of service. That way, white people at least could start on terms of relative equality, kind of like in New England. So as you read and prepare, think about how these histories are changing. You now know sort of the traditional story. Think about how the traditional story changes when you subject it to the light of evidence. Thanks.